The morning mist clung to Redemption Cemetery like the breath of ghosts reluctant to leave, and in its ethereal embrace, Esperanza Blackwood knelt beside a weathered headstone with charcoal-stained fingers tracing names that would never answer back. She had been coming here since dawn broke over the Texas plains, her bare feet having found their familiar path through the sage and wildflowers that grew untamed between the graves. At 21, Hope, as Maria had called her, in whispered Spanish lullabies, possessed the kind of beauty that seemed carved from sorrow itself. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her eyes held depths that spoke of secrets buried deeper than any coffin in this hallowed ground. She had not spoken aloud in 14 years, not since the night her father Eduardo died with Maxwell Holden's knife between his ribs and his daughter's terrified face burned into his fading vision. But Hope had other ways of listening to the dead. Her fingers moved across the rough granite of Maria Esperanza's headstone, and suddenly the world shifted. Colors bled away like watercolors in rain, and she could feel it, the echo of Maria's final moments, the way her foster mother's heart had stuttered with more than just the poison Maxwell had been feeding her in nightly doses of bitter tea. There had been hope in Maria's dying thoughts, a fierce joy that made no sense until Hope felt the phantom weight of a letter being pressed into desperate hands. "The boy lives," came Maria's voice from beyond death, as clear as if she stood beside the grave. "Diego lives, and he remembers everything." Hope's breath caught a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for wind through the cemetery's ancient oaks. She pulled her hand back from the stone, the vision dissolving like smoke, leaving her with the familiar ache that came after touching the remnants of the departed. It was a gift she had discovered by accident years ago, this ability to glimpse the final memories of those who had passed, but it was also a curse that left her feeling more connected to the dead than to the living. Except for Thomas. The thought of him waiting in the stone cellar beneath Maxwell's house filled her with the only warmth she had known since Maria's death 6 months ago. Thomas Whitmore, though he bore the name of the monster who had destroyed both their lives, was the single thread of goodness that kept Hope tethered to this world. At 19, he had never spoken a word aloud, his voice stolen not by choice like Hope's, but by a cruelty so profound it had shattered something essential in his young mind. Hope rose from her knees, her white cotton dress ghost-like in the morning light, and began the walk back toward the sprawling ranch that had been her prison for 14 years. But as she crested the small hill that overlooked the valley, she stopped dead at the sight of 3 riders approaching along the main road. Federal marshals by the look of their badges and the purposeful way they sat their horses. Hope's enhanced senses, sharpened by years of navigating Maxwell's dangerous moods, caught fragments of conversation carried on the Texas wind. Reports of missing children in the territory. Apache families filing complaints with the Bureau. Holden's ranch is the last place they were seen alive. Hope's heart began to race, but not with the fear that might have been expected. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced in years, hope itself as sharp and dangerous as a blade fresh from the forge. If federal agents were finally investigating Maxwell's crimes, if someone in authority was listening to the whispers about missing Apache children and the screams that echoed from the ranch's hidden cellars. She pressed herself against the trunk of a cottonwood. As the riders drew closer, her artist's eye cataloging details with the precision of someone whose life had depended on reading faces and body language. The lead rider was younger than his companions, perhaps 28, with the lean build of a man who lived in the saddle. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, that sent recognition flooding through Hope's chest like ice water. The shape of his profile against the morning sky. The careful grace with which he dismounted. The way his hand moved to adjust his hat, all echoes of gestures she remembered from a childhood that felt like another lifetime. Diego, the name formed soundlessly on her lips, a prayer, and an accusation wrapped in 2 syllables. Her brother grown into a man she would not have recognized if not for the phantom weight of Maria's dying memory. Diego, who had vanished the night their father died, leaving Hope to believe she was the only survivor of Maxwell's violence. But Maria's final gift suggested otherwise. Diego had not died that terrible night he had escaped grown up, become someone with the authority to return and demand answers for crimes too long hidden in shadow. Hope watched from concealment as the 3 federal agents approached Maxwell's house. She could see him emerging from the main building, already wearing the mask of rural hospitality he had perfected over the years, the slight stoop that made him appear less threatening, the carefully modulated voice that suggested humble respectability, the way he kept his hands visible and empty to project trustworthiness. "Gentlemen, Maxwell called out, striding toward the riders with arms spread wide. "Welcome to the Lone Star Ranch. I'm Maxwell Holden, and you must be the federal agents I've been expecting." The young man who looked like Diego stepped forward, removing his hat with practiced courtesy. "Agent Diego Martinez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. These are Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us, Mr. Holden." Martinez. Not Blackwood, the name their father had worn with pride. But then a man building a new identity would need a new name, and Diego had always been clever about such things. Hope remembered him teaching her to write her letters, showing her how to forge their father's signature on permission slips for school activities they could never afford to attend. The memory brought a sharp pang of loss that was immediately complicated by a more dangerous emotion. Hope. If Diego had survived, if he had grown into someone with federal authority, then perhaps this was the beginning of the justice she had dreamed about through 14 years of silent servitude. But as she watched the agents follow Maxwell toward the house, Hope noticed details that made her artist's instincts whisper warnings. The way Diego's eyes moved, not with the alertness of a lawman expecting danger, but with the careful assessment of someone already familiar with the terrain. The subtle positioning that kept him partially behind his colleagues while maintaining clear sightlines to exits and cover. Most troubling of all was the barely perceptible nod that passed between Diego and Maxwell when the older man's back was turned to the other agents. It was quick, so brief that someone not trained to read micro-expressions would miss it entirely. But Hope had spent 14 years learning to interpret Maxwell's moods from the slightest facial twitches, and she recognized the gesture of acknowledgement between conspirators. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. If she was reading the signs correctly, this was not the rescue she had prayed for. This was something else entirely. A new chapter in Maxwell's long history of deception, with Diego playing a role that made Hope's childhood memories feel like beautiful lies told to a naive girl who no longer existed. The agents disappeared into the house, and Hope made her way toward the servants' entrance she had used countless times over the years. Maxwell would expect her to prepare coffee and food for his guests, to play the role of the silent, damaged girl who served his needs without question or complaint. It was a performance she had perfected, but today it would serve a different purpose. Today she would listen with the ears of someone planning her next move, rather than simply enduring her current circumstances. Hope slipped into the kitchen through the rear door, her bare feet silent on the worn wooden floors. The house felt different with the agents inside it charged with new possibilities and dangers she was only beginning to understand. From the dining room, she could hear Maxwell launching into his prepared speech about being a law-abiding citizen plagued by criminal elements operating in the surrounding wilderness. But Hope's attention was focused on something else, the strange pull she felt whenever she passed the door that led to the stone cellars beneath the house. Down there in the cool darkness that smelled of earth and secrets, Thomas waited for her daily visit with the patience of someone who had learned that hope deferred was not hope denied. She had discovered him 3 years ago during one of Maxwell's longer absences, when she had been bold enough to explore the parts of the house normally forbidden to her. The cellar had seemed empty at first, just another storage space filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings. But then she had heard it not a sound, but the absence of sound in a way that suggested someone holding their breath. Thomas had been crouched in the farthest corner, a young man who looked more like a caged animal than a human being. His clothes were clean, but worn, his hair cut short in a way that suggested regular care despite his imprisonment. When their eyes met across the dusty space, Hope had seen recognition there, not of her personally, but of kinship. Here was another person who understood what it meant to be broken by Maxwell Holden's particular brand of cruelty. It had taken weeks for Thomas to trust her enough to accept the food she brought, months for him to understand that she meant him no harm. And in all that time, neither of them had spoken a word aloud. Thomas because he could not, Hope because she would not. But they had found other ways to communicate through gestures, through drawings scratched in the dirt floor, through the 1,000 small kindnesses that can exist between two souls who have learned to survive in hell. The sound of chairs scraping against wood told Hope that the agents were settling into the dining room. She began preparing coffee with mechanical precision, but her mind was racing with possibilities and plans. If Diego was truly in partnership with Maxwell, their presence here represented not opportunity, but danger. They would be looking for ways to eliminate witnesses and loose ends to clean up the evidence of crimes that had been accumulating for more than a decade. Hope was certainly a loose end, and so was Thomas. But what Maxwell and Diego didn't know was that Hope had been preparing for this day since Maria's death 6 months ago. The grief of losing her foster mother had crystallized something in Hope's heart, transforming years of patient endurance into something harder and more focused. She had begun to plan not just for survival, but for justice. And she had begun to document everything. Hope finished preparing the coffee service and arranged it on a silver tray that had once belonged to her father's family before Maxwell had stolen it along with everything else. As she carried the tray toward the dining room, she passed the narrow staircase that led down to the cellars. She paused there for just a moment, touching the wooden banister with one finger. The vision that came was not from the dead this time, but from the living. Through her strange gift, she could sense Thomas's presence below, could feel his awareness of the strangers in the house above. There was fear in his psychic signature, but also something else. A fierce protectiveness that made Hope's throat tighten with emotion. Thomas was afraid for her, not for himself. Even trapped in his stone prison, his first thought was for her safety. Hope composed her face into the mask of blank servility Maxwell expected and pushed through the swinging door into the dining room. The three agents sat around the polished oak table while Maxwell held court at the head, gesturing expansively as he painted himself as a victim of circumstance. "The thing you have to understand, gentlemen," Maxwell was saying, "is that we're dealing with organized criminal elements here. Apache families have been selling their own children to human traffickers operating out of Mexico. It's a tragedy, but it's also a reality we can't ignore." Hope set the coffee service on the sideboard and began filling cups, her movements careful and deliberate. As she worked, she studied the faces around the table through her peripheral vision. Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes looked genuinely disturbed by Maxwell's account, their notebooks open as they recorded his lies. But Diego's expression was different too, controlled, too knowing. When she reached Diego's place at the table, Hope set down his coffee cup with the same neutral efficiency she had shown the others. But as she did, her fingers brushed against his hand in what would appear to be an accident. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Through her gift, Hope glimpsed fragments of Diego's recent memories, not the dying echoes of the departed, but the living thoughts of someone who believed himself undetected. She saw meetings in shadowy rooms with Maxwell and other men she didn't recognize. She felt the weight of gold coins changing hands, the satisfaction of plans coming to fruition. Most damaging of all, she sensed the carefully controlled excitement of someone anticipating a large payday that would come from silencing witnesses and claiming ownership of something valuable. Her father's silver mine. Hope's hand trembled slightly as she moved away from Diego's chair, but she managed to maintain her facade of empty-headed servility. Inside, however, her world was reshaping itself around this new understanding of betrayal. Her brother, the boy who had once carved wooden horses for her and taught her to read, had not just survived their father's murder. He had profited from it. Worse, he was here to finish what Maxwell had started 14 years ago. "The missing children you're investigating," Maxwell continued, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. "I believe they've been taken south across the border. The Apache families that still live in the territory have connections to the criminal cartels in Mexico. It's a pipeline that's been operating for years. More lies delivered with the smooth confidence of a man who had perfected his story through repetition. Hope had seen the truth hidden in the ranch's stone cellars and forgotten corners, children who had been taken not south to Mexico, but north to buyers who paid premium prices for young servants who would never be missed. Some of those children had died during Maxwell's training process. Hope had felt their final moments when she touched the belongings left behind in empty cells. Their terror and confusion burned into objects that held memory like scars. But others had survived long enough to be sold, disappearing into lives of servitude that made Hope's own captivity seem gentle by comparison. Thomas was the only one Maxwell had kept for himself, a trophy from one of his earliest crimes that he tortured for entertainment during his darker moods. "What evidence do you have of this trafficking operation?" Inspector Hayes asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man settling in to share hard-won wisdom. "Well, I can't prove anything you understand, but there have been signs. Strange riders at night heading south toward the border. Smoke signals from the canyon country where no one should be camping. And the timing the children always disappear during the new moon, when the darkness provides cover for movement." Hope continued her circuit around the table, refilling cups and arranging small plates with the mechanical precision that Maxwell had trained into her through years of punishment and reward. But her mind was cataloging every lie, every misdirection, every attempt to shift blame away from the real perpetrator. She had spent 14 years learning Maxwell's patterns, and she recognized this performance. He was building towards something, creating a narrative that would justify whatever action he was planning to take. The story about Mexican traffickers and Apache collaborators was not random. It was designed to provide cover for new crimes. Diego spoke for the first time since the introductions, his voice carrying the authority of his federal credentials. "These smoke signals you mentioned, have you seen them recently?" "Just last week," Maxwell replied without hesitation. 3 nights running, coming from Devil's Canyon about 20 miles south of here. My hands were too spooked to investigate, but I rode out there myself the next morning. Found signs of a large camp recently abandoned. Hope's blood chilled as she processed the implications. Devil's Canyon was where Maxwell buried the evidence of his crimes, including she suspected her father's remains. If he was directing federal agents there, it could only mean he had prepared some kind of trap or false evidence to support his story about Mexican traffickers. But it could also mean he was planning to eliminate the agents themselves, adding 3 more bodies to the canyon's collection, while blaming their deaths on the fictional criminals he had spent years creating. As Hope moved behind Inspector Hayes's chair, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The man's jacket was hanging open, revealing a leather portfolio tucked into his inner pocket. Through the gap in the leather, she could see the edge of official documents, possibly warrants or investigation reports that might contain information about the scope of the federal inquiry. Hope's gift didn't work on inanimate objects unless they had been touched recently by someone with strong emotions, but the portfolio was practically radiating psychic residue. Inspector Hayes had been handling those documents with intense focus and determination, his professional dedication leaving traces that Hope could read like fingerprints. When she leaned forward to refill his coffee cup, her arm brushed against the portfolio. The contact was brief, but sufficient for her gift to activate. Images flooded her mind. Not Hayes's memories, but the emotional impressions left by other agents who had handled the documents. She saw photographs of missing children, testimony from Apache families, and most importantly, a list of suspects that included not just Maxwell Holden, but also several federal agents suspected of corruption. Diego Martinez was not just investigating crimes, he was actively covering them up, using his federal authority to misdirect and obstruct justice. The other agents at this table were honest men walking into a trap, and they had no idea that one of their colleagues was planning to betray them. Hope finished refilling cups and retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. She had perhaps an hour before Maxwell and Diego made their move, whatever form that move might take. An hour to decide whether she would continue playing the role of helpless victim or finally act on the plans she had been developing since Maria's death. The choice, when it came to her, was surprisingly easy. Hope had been preparing for war for 6 months. Today, the war would finally begin. She moved through the house with new purpose, making her way toward the door that led to the stone cellars. Thomas would need to know what was coming, and after that she would need to gather the evidence she had been collecting for 14 years, evidence that could destroy Maxwell's carefully constructed empire and expose Diego's betrayal to the honest agents who still believed they were hunting criminals instead of working alongside them. Hope paused at the top of the cellar stairs, listening to ensure that the men in the dining room were still engaged in their deadly performance. Maxwell's voice carried clearly as he continued spinning his web of lies, setting up the federal agents for whatever fate he and Diego had planned. But what Maxwell didn't know was that Hope had been spinning her own web for far longer and with far more patience. She had learned from him, studied his methods, understood his psychology. Most importantly, she had learned to use his own weapons against him: deception, misdirection, and the careful manipulation of truth. Hope descended the stone steps into darkness, her bare feet finding each familiar stair without conscious thought. At the bottom, she struck a match and lit the oil lamp she kept hidden behind a loose stone in the wall. The warm light revealed the cellar's secrets, not just Thomas waiting in his corner, with eyes that held relief at her appearance, but also the carefully preserved evidence of Maxwell's crimes. Hidden beneath loose floorboards and behind false walls, Hope had been gathering proof for years. Photographs she had taken with a camera stolen from Maxwell's office. Documents copied during his absences. Most importantly, the detailed journals she had kept recording every crime she had witnessed, every victim she had seen disappear, every lie Maxwell had told to cover his tracks. But today, for the first time, she would also have living witnesses to testify to the truth. Hope knelt beside Thomas and began to sign with her hands using the silent language they had developed together over years of secret communication. His eyes widened as she explained what was happening above, but when she reached the part about Diego's betrayal, something changed in his expression. Thomas raised his own hands and began to sign back his movements quick and urgent. What he told her made Hope's blood run cold. Thomas had seen Diego before, not recently, but years ago during his early captivity. Diego had been one of the men who delivered him to Maxwell, one of the federal agents who had sold an Apache child into slavery for a share of the profits. Diego wasn't just covering up Maxwell's current crimes. He had been part of them from the beginning, using his federal credentials to facilitate the kidnapping and sale of Native American children while officially investigating the very crimes he was helping to commit. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Hope had imagined, extending into the highest levels of federal law enforcement. But it also meant that Diego had made a crucial mistake by returning to the scene of his crimes. He had put himself within reach of the justice he had been evading for years. Hope gathered her hidden evidence and prepared to return to the upper floors of the house. The agents in the dining room were honest men who deserved to know the truth about their colleague's betrayal. More importantly, they represented Hope's best chance to finally see justice served for her father's murder and all the crimes that had followed. But as she climbed the stone steps back toward the light, Hope carried with her the weight of a decision that would change everything. Today she would break her 14 years of silence. Today she would speak the truth that Maxwell and Diego had tried so hard to bury. And today she would finally hear her own voice raised in something other than grief or fear. Behind her in the cellar, Thomas watched her go with eyes that held understanding and support. He had learned to survive in hell, but Hope was about to learn something even more dangerous. She was about to learn how to escape it. The war for justice was about to begin, and this time Hope intended to win. Hope emerged from the cellar with her bundle of evidence clutched against her chest, like a shield against the storm she was about to unleash. The voices from the dining room had grown more animated, Maxwell's performance reaching its crescendo as he painted his false narrative with increasing conviction. But now Hope could hear the subtle undertones she had missed before the way Diego's questions guided the conversation toward predetermined conclusions, the practiced synchronization between two men who had been partners in deception for far longer than anyone suspected. She made her way through the servants' corridor to her small room at the back of the house, the space that had been both sanctuary and prison for 14 years. The room was sparse by necessity. Maxwell allowed her few possessions, but every item she did own had been chosen for its dual purpose. The sewing basket that concealed lockpicks fashioned from stolen wire, the water pitcher with a false bottom that held her most precious photographs, the loose floorboard beneath her narrow bed that concealed the journal where she recorded everything. Hope knelt and pried up the familiar board, retrieving the leather-bound book that contained 14 years of meticulous documentation. Every page was filled with her careful handwriting dates, times descriptions of crimes witnessed and victims encountered. She had taught herself to write in multiple languages using Spanish when she recorded conversations. Maxwell thought she couldn't understand Apache symbols when she documented the cultural artifacts he had stolen along with children's lives. But today she added something new to the journal's pages. In clear, bold letters across a fresh page, she wrote, "The day I found my voice again." The irony was not lost on her that she had learned the power of words by choosing not to speak them. 14 years of silence had taught her that communication was about more than sound. It was about intention timing and the careful observation of what others revealed when they believed themselves unobserved. Hope tucked the journal into the bodice of her dress and secured the other evidence in a canvas bag she could carry discreetly. Then she moved to her small mirror and studied her reflection with the critical eye of someone preparing for battle. The girl who looked back at her was pale but determined, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of secrets too long kept in darkness. For the first time in 14 years, Hope smiled at her own reflection. The sound of chairs scraping against wood told her the meeting in the dining room was breaking up. Hope quickly concealed her evidence and adopted the posture of servility Maxwell expected, but inside she felt the unfamiliar sensation of her own power awakening. Today she would stop being Maxwell's victim and become his nemesis. She emerged from her room to find Maxwell escorting the 3 agents toward the front door, his voice warm with false hospitality. "I'll have my best tracker ready at dawn tomorrow," Maxwell was saying. "We'll ride out to Devil's Canyon and see what evidence we can find of this trafficking operation. I promise you, gentlemen, we'll get to the bottom of this." Diego nodded gravely. My superiors in Washington are very interested in breaking up these cross-border operations. If we can gather solid evidence tomorrow, it could lead to arrests throughout the territory. The only arrests that would be made, Hope knew, would be posthumous ones. Maxwell and Diego were planning to kill the honest agents in Devil's Canyon and stage the scene to support their story about Mexican traffickers. Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes were walking into an ambush, and they had no idea that their trusted colleague was leading them to slaughter. But Hope had other plans. As the agents prepared to mount their horses for the ride back to town, Hope caught Diego's attention with a subtle movement, not quite a gesture, but the kind of peripheral motion that would register in the subconscious of someone trained to notice details. When he glanced in her direction, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Hope let him see recognition there. Not the blank acceptance Maxwell expected from his damaged servant, but the clear awareness of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. She watched Diego's face pale as he processed the implications of that look, saw his hand move unconsciously toward his weapon before training and caution stopped him. The message had been delivered. Diego now knew that his identity had been compromised, but he couldn't be certain how much Hope knew or what she intended to do with that knowledge. The uncertainty would eat at him, forcing him to make mistakes that Hope could exploit. After the agents departed, Maxwell returned to the house with the satisfied air of a man whose plans were proceeding smoothly. He found Hope in the kitchen, cleaning the coffee service with her usual mechanical precision. "Good girl," he said, his voice carrying its familiar note of condescending approval. "You played your part perfectly today. Tomorrow will be even more important. We'll finally be rid of those meddlesome federal agents, and I can complete the arrangements I've been making." Hope continued washing dishes without acknowledgement, but her enhanced hearing caught the excitement in Maxwell's voice. Whatever arrangements he was making involved more than just eliminating the current investigation. He was planning something larger, something that required the removal of all potential witnesses and obstacles, including her. "I've been thinking about your future, Elena," Maxwell continued, using the name he had assigned to her years ago when he decided that Hope Blackwood had died along with her father. "You've been a good servant, but you're getting older now. Less manageable. I think it might be time to find you a new situation." The euphemism was crystal clear. Maxwell was planning to sell her the same way he had sold dozens of Apache children over the years. Or perhaps something even worse. Perhaps he intended to dispose of her, permanently eliminating the last living witness to his crimes. But Hope had been expecting this conversation for months. Maxwell's paranoia grew stronger as his empire expanded, and he had never fully trusted her silence. He suspected that beneath her facade of damaged compliance lay someone capable of bringing his world crashing down. He was right to be suspicious. Hope finished drying the last cup and turned to face Maxwell directly, something she had not done voluntarily in years. He seemed startled by the eye contact, his expression shifting from casual cruelty to wary attention. "You have something to say, girl." Hope held his gaze for a long moment, letting him see the intelligence he had tried so hard to crush. Then slowly and deliberately she shook her head. "Not yet, but soon." The gesture seemed to unnerve Maxwell more than words would have. He studied her face with the sharp focus of a predator who sensed danger but couldn't identify its source. "Get to your room," he said finally. "Tomorrow will be a long day, and I want you well rested for the journey." Journey. Another euphemism, but Hope understood the implication. Maxwell was planning to take her somewhere remote, somewhere her disappearance could be staged to look like an accident, or attack by the same fictional criminals he was using to cover his other crimes. Hope nodded submissively and made her way toward her room, but she didn't go there directly. Instead, she slipped down the narrow staircase to the stone cellars, her bare feet silent on the worn steps. Thomas would need to know what was coming, and she would need to prepare him for the role he would play in the justice that was finally approaching. She found Thomas exactly where she had left him, sitting cross-legged in his corner, with the patience of someone who had learned that time moved differently in captivity. His eyes brightened when he saw her, and Hope felt the familiar pang of protective love that Thomas inspired in her heart. Hope lit the oil lamp and settled beside Thomas, their knees almost touching in the intimate space that had become their sanctuary. She began to sign with her hands, explaining Maxwell's plans and the timeline they were facing. Thomas listened with the intense focus of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to sign back his movements, careful and precise. "Why did you never try to escape?" he asked. You're not chained here like I am." Hope considered the question, looking for words to explain the psychological chains that had bound her more securely than any physical restraint. Finally, she signed back. "I was waiting for you." The simple honesty of the statement seemed to strike Thomas like a physical blow. His eyes filled with tears, the first emotion Hope had ever seen him display so openly. "You stayed because of me," he signed. "I stayed because someone needed to bear witness," Hope corrected gently. "But I also stayed because I couldn't leave you here alone. And I stayed because I knew that someday the chance for justice would come. Today is that day." Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, then signed with sudden urgency. "What about the federal agents? They don't know about Diego's betrayal." "They will," Hope promised. "But first, I need you to help me with something. Something that will require you to be very brave." She explained what she needed from Thomas, not just cooperation, but active participation in the plan she had been developing for months. It would require him to leave the safety of his cellar prison to venture into the world above where Maxwell's men roamed like predators seeking prey. Thomas listened to the entire plan without interruption, his expression growing more determined with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for so long that Hope began to worry he would refuse to participate. Finally, he began to sign, "I've been waiting 19 years to help someone fight back." "Yes. Whatever you need, yes." Hope felt tears prick her own eyes. In all her years of suffering, she had never had an ally who understood the stakes as clearly as Thomas did. Together, they could accomplish what neither could manage alone. She spent the next hour going over the plan in detail, making sure Thomas understood his role and the timing that would be crucial to their success. When she was satisfied that he knew what was expected of him, she prepared to return to the upper levels of the house. But before she left, Thomas caught her hand and held it gently. When she looked at him questioningly, he signed with careful deliberation. "When this is over, when Maxwell is gone, will you teach me to speak aloud?" Hope's throat tightened with emotion. Thomas had never expressed interest in verbal communication, before seeming content with their shared language of gestures and signs. But perhaps the approach of freedom was awakening possibilities he had never dared to consider. "Yes," she signed back. "If you want to learn, I will teach you. We'll learn together." The promise felt like a sacred vow, a commitment to a future neither of them had believed possible until today. Hope squeezed Thomas's hand once, then released it, and made her way back up the stone stairs. The house was dark now, Maxwell having retired to his room to prepare for tomorrow's murderous expedition. Hope moved through the familiar corridors like a ghost, her bare feet finding silent purchase on floors she could navigate blindfolded. She paused outside Maxwell's door, listening to his breathing pattern until she was certain he was asleep. Then she made her way to the room she had never been allowed to enter Maxwell's private study. The door was locked, but Hope had learned many skills during her years of captivity. The lockpicks she had fashioned from stolen wire made quick work of the simple mechanism, and soon she stood in the sanctum where Maxwell conducted his most private business. The room smelled of tobacco and whiskey leather and old paper. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, Hope could see the massive desk that dominated the space its surface covered with maps and correspondence. Behind the desk, a painting of a peaceful landscape concealed the safe where Maxwell kept his most incriminating evidence. Hope had watched him open that safe countless times over the years, memorizing the combination through careful observation of his hand movements. She moved the painting aside and worked the dial with practiced precision. 1867, the year Texas was readmitted to the Union, a date that meant something to Maxwell's twisted sense of destiny. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing stacks of documents, bags of coins, and most importantly, a collection of photographs that documented Maxwell's crimes in devastating detail. Hope had suspected these existed. Maxwell was too proud of his accomplishments to resist keeping trophies, but seeing them confirmed her worst fears about the scope of his operation. Photographs of children in chains. Images of Apache families being separated and sold. Most damning of all, pictures of federal agents, including a younger Diego Martinez accepting payment for their cooperation in the trafficking network. Hope gathered the most incriminating photographs and documents, replacing them with blank papers of similar size and weight. Maxwell would not discover the theft unless he conducted a detailed inventory, and by then it would be too late. She closed the safe and returned the painting to its proper position, then made her way back to her own room. The evidence she had gathered tonight, combined with the documentation she had been collecting for years, would be more than sufficient to destroy Maxwell's empire and expose the corruption that extended into federal law enforcement. But first, she needed to ensure that Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes survived tomorrow's expedition to Devil's Canyon. Hope spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing for what she knew would be the most dangerous day of her life. She dressed in dark, practical clothing that would allow her to move silently through rough terrain. She packed the evidence in waterproof containers that could survive whatever violence tomorrow might bring. Most importantly, she wrote a letter explaining everything she knew about Maxwell's crimes and Diego's betrayal, a letter that would serve as her testimony if she did not survive to give it in person. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky pale gold, Hope heard sounds of activity from the barn where Maxwell's men were saddling horses for the expedition. Soon the honest federal agents would arrive, walking unknowingly toward the trap that had been set for them. But Hope had set her own trap, one that had been 14 years in the making. She made her way to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast with the same mechanical efficiency Maxwell expected, but inside she felt the strange calm that comes before decisive action. Today she would either achieve the justice she had been seeking for half her life, or she would die in the attempt. Either outcome felt like victory after 14 years of helpless endurance. The sound of approaching horses told her the federal agents had arrived right on schedule. Through the kitchen window, she could see them dismounting Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes, looking alert and professional, Diego maintaining his facade of dedicated law enforcement, while privately calculating the best moment to betray his colleagues. Maxwell emerged from the house already wearing his mask of rural hospitality, but Hope could see the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man preparing for violence. "Gentlemen," Maxwell called out. "Right on time. I have fresh horses saddled and my best tracker ready to guide us to Devil's Canyon." Hope watched from the kitchen window as the men made their final preparations, checking weapons and supplies with the thoroughness of professionals embarking on dangerous work. None of them suspected that the greatest danger they faced came not from the fictional criminals they were hunting, but from the men they trusted as allies. But Hope knew, and today her knowledge would finally become power. She gathered the breakfast she had prepared and loaded it onto a wooden tray, then made her way toward the dining room where the men would eat their final meal together. As she walked, Hope felt something she had not experienced in 14 years, the anticipation of speaking her own truth in her own voice. The silence that had been her prison was about to become her weapon. Hope pushed through the swinging door into the dining room where 4 men sat around the table discussing routes and tactics for the day's expedition. She moved around the table with her usual efficiency, serving food and pouring coffee, while listening to their conversation with ears that now heard every nuance of deception and truth. When she reached Diego's place at the table, Hope set down his plate with careful precision. As she did, she leaned close enough for only him to hear and whispered 2 words in Spanish, so softly they might have been mistaken for the sound of her breathing. "Sé todo." "I know everything." Diego's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as his hand trembled with shock. Hope straightened and continued around the table as if nothing had happened, but she could feel Diego's eyes boring into her back with the intensity of a man who had just seen his own destruction approaching. The first words Hope had spoken aloud in 14 years were a declaration of war, and the war was just beginning. The words hung in the air between Hope and Diego like a blade drawn for the first time in 14 years. "Sé todo. I know everything." Diego's face had gone pale as desert bone, but he recovered quickly, years of deception teaching him to mask his terror behind professional composure. Hope continued serving breakfast as if she had not just shattered the foundation of his carefully constructed world, but every person at the table could feel the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, the way air grows heavy before lightning strikes. Maxwell's eyes moved between Hope and Diego, his predator's instincts sensing disturbance but not yet understanding its source. Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes remained focused on their meal and their discussion of the day's route, unaware that the woman serving their coffee had just fired the opening shot in a war they didn't know was being fought around them. "The canyon country can be treacherous," Maxwell was saying, his voice carrying its practiced note of concerned expertise. "Flash floods, rock slides, Apache war parties that still refuse to acknowledge the new territorial boundaries. We'll need to stay alert. More misdirection, more lies designed to explain away whatever violence he was planning." Hope had heard variations of this speech countless times over the years, each iteration refined to match the particular audience Maxwell was trying to deceive. But as she moved around the table, Hope's enhanced senses caught something that made her blood freeze. The sound of horses approaching from the north, multiple riders moving fast, their mounts' hooves striking the ground with the urgent rhythm of men pursuing or fleeing something. Through the window, she could see dust clouds rising on the horizon, too large and too organized to be casual travelers. Maxwell's reinforcements were arriving ahead of schedule. Hope's mind raced through the implications. If Maxwell's hired killers were approaching the house now, it meant the timeline for the morning's deception had changed. Instead of waiting for the federal agents to ride into a trap at Devil's Canyon, Maxwell had decided to eliminate them here on his own territory, where he could control every variable. She caught Diego's eye and saw the same recognition there. He had been expecting this development, had probably arranged for it during some private communication with Maxwell that the honest agents were not meant to overhear. The trap was closing much sooner than Hope had anticipated. But Hope had been preparing for this moment longer than any of them realized. 14 years of patient observation had taught her that Maxwell's greatest weakness was his need to be the center of his own narrative, his compulsion to explain and justify his actions, even when silence would serve him better. That weakness was about to destroy him. Hope finished serving the meal and retreated to her position near the kitchen door, but instead of disappearing into the servants' quarters as Maxwell expected, she remained visible in the doorway. When Maxwell glanced in her direction with the casual dismissal he always showed toward her presence, Hope did something she had never done before. She smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting 14 years for this moment, who had endured unspeakable cruelties while planning the perfect revenge. It was the smile of justice deferred but not denied, and it transformed Hope's face from that of a damaged victim into something far more dangerous. Maxwell's fork froze halfway to his mouth. In all the years he had known her, he had never seen Hope display any emotion stronger than resigned compliance. The smile on her face now spoke of secrets and plans of power carefully concealed, but finally ready to reveal itself. Elena, Maxwell's voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been there moments before. Is something wrong? Hope's smile widened. Then, for the second time in 14 years, she spoke aloud. Her voice was soft, almost musical after its long silence, but every word carried the weight of accumulated truth. My name is not Elena, she said in perfect, clear English that held no trace of the damaged servility Maxwell had trained her to project. My name is Esperanza Blackwood. I am the daughter of Eduardo Blackwood, whom you murdered 14 years ago to steal his land and his discovery of the silver mine that has made you rich. And I have been waiting all this time to see you pay for your crimes. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to stop time itself. Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes stared at Hope with expressions of shock and growing understanding. Maxwell's face had turned the color of old bone, while Diego's hand moved slowly toward the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. But Hope was not finished. Marshal Crawford, Inspector Hayes, she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. The man you trust as a federal colleague has been working with Maxwell Holden for more than 15 years. Diego Martinez is not his real name. He is Diego Blackwood, my brother, who betrayed our father to Maxwell in exchange for gold and a share in the trafficking network they have operated together ever since. Diego's weapon cleared leather with practiced speed, but Hope had been expecting this. She dropped to the floor behind the heavy wooden table as his first shot splintered the doorframe where her head had been moments before. She's lying, Diego shouted, his careful facade finally cracking under pressure. The girl is delusional, traumatized by her father's death. She's been living in fantasy for years. But Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes were already moving their own weapons drawn as they processed the implications of Diego's violent response. Innocent men did not shoot witnesses who accused them of crimes. They demanded proof, called for investigations, relied on legal processes to clear their names. Drop your weapon, Martinez, Crawford commanded, his service revolver trained on his colleague. We need to hear what the lady has to say. There's nothing to hear, Maxwell snarled, rising from his chair with his own gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. The girl is a damaged half-breed who's been my ward since her father died of fever years ago. She's never been right in the head. Hope laughed, actually laughed from her position behind the overturned table. The sound was clear and bright, and utterly without fear, and it seemed to unnerve the two killers more than screaming would have. Fever, Hope called out. Is that the story you've been telling Maxwell? How interesting, because I have photographs of my father's body showing the knife wounds you inflicted. I have documents proving his legal ownership of the land you stole. Most importantly, I have testimony from witnesses who are still alive, witnesses you thought you had eliminated. Through the kitchen window, Hope could see Maxwell's reinforcements approaching the house, 6 men on horseback, all armed, all wearing the hard expressions of professional killers. But she could also see something else that filled her with fierce satisfaction, figures moving among the rocks and scrub brush that surrounded the ranch Apache, warriors positioning themselves for the battle they had known was coming. Hope had not spent 14 years in passive captivity. She had spent them building alliances, gathering evidence, and preparing for the day when justice would finally be possible. The Apache families whose children had been stolen by Maxwell's network had been waiting for this opportunity as long as she had. "You want to know about witnesses, Maxwell?" Hope called out, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "Let me tell you about Thomas Whitmore, the Apache boy you've kept chained in your cellar for 5 years, the son of Joseph Red Cloud, whose testimony will hang you for kidnapping and slavery, even if everything else fails to stick." Maxwell's face went white. Thomas was his most closely guarded secret, the trophy he kept hidden from everyone, including his own men. The fact that Hope not only knew about Thomas, but understood his true identity, meant that his security had been compromised in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. "How do you—" Maxwell began, but his question was cut off by the sound of splintering wood from somewhere deeper in the house. Thomas had begun his part of Hope's plan. The cellar door had been locked from the outside for 5 years, but Hope had been bringing Thomas tools along with food during their daily visits. Lockpicks, small files, anything that might eventually help him break free when the moment was right. Last night she had given him the key she had stolen from Maxwell's desk, along with detailed instructions about what to do when the shooting started. Thomas was free, and he was moving through the house with the silent precision of someone who had studied every board and stone during years of captivity. His destination was Maxwell's study, where the safe contained evidence that would corroborate everything Hope was claiming. But more importantly, Thomas was carrying something else, documents that Hope had prepared months ago, copies of all her evidence and testimony that would survive even if she did not live to present them in person. The sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Maxwell's reinforcements reached the house and encountered the Apache warriors Hope had positioned around the property. Through the windows, Hope could see muzzle flashes and clouds of gun smoke as 2 forces that had been preparing for this battle finally met in open combat. Inside the dining room, the standoff continued. Diego and Maxwell had taken cover behind an overturned china cabinet, their weapons trained on the federal agents who crouched behind chairs and table legs that provided minimal protection. Hope remained behind her wooden barricade, but she was no longer content to simply hide. She had been silent for 14 years. She had stories to tell. "Inspector Hayes," Hope called out. "In your jacket pocket, you're carrying investigation files that include a list of suspected corrupt federal agents. Look at that list and tell me if you see the name Diego Martinez." Hayes reached into his jacket with his left hand while keeping his weapon trained on Diego with his right. When he withdrew the leather folder and flipped it open, his face went grim. "Martinez Diego, suspected of taking bribes from trafficking networks. Wanted for questioning in connection with disappearances in New Mexico territory," Hayes read aloud. "Jesus Christ, Diego. How long have you been working with these people?" 15 years, Hope answered before Diego could respond. "Since he was 14 years old and angry about being poor. Maxwell recruited him by promising wealth and status, then used his federal credentials to cover their crimes while eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth." Diego's response was to fire another shot in Hope's direction, but his aim was wild with desperation, and the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the wooden wall behind her position. "Marshal Crawford," Hope continued, her voice growing stronger as she finally gave voice to 14 years of accumulated testimony. "Maxwell Holden has been operating a child trafficking network that has kidnapped and sold more than 200 Apache children over the past decade. The basement of this house contained cells where victims were held before being transported to buyers throughout the territory." Maxwell's face had gone beyond pale into a sickly gray that spoke of a man watching his entire world crumble around him. Every word Hope spoke was destroying years of careful construction, revealing the scope of crimes that extended far beyond simple robbery or murder. "She's lying," Maxwell snarled, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "There are no cells. There's nothing in the basement but storage. "Then you won't mind if Marshal Crawford goes down to look," Hope replied sweetly. "The entrance is through the kitchen pantry. Thomas is down there right now gathering the evidence that will hang you both." As if summoned by her words, Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway behind Hope's position. But the young man who emerged was not the broken prisoner Maxwell had kept chained in darkness for years. Thomas stood straight and tall, his shoulders squared with dignity, reclaimed his eyes blazing with the fire of someone who had finally found his voice. And when Thomas spoke, his words rang clear and strong throughout the house. "My name is Thomas Red Cloud," he announced in a voice unused to speech but determined to be heard. "I am the son of Joseph Red Cloud of the Mescalero Apache. 5 years ago, federal agents working with Maxwell Holden kidnapped me from my family's camp and sold me into slavery. I have been imprisoned in this house ever since, forced to watch as other children were brought here, brutalized, and sold to the highest bidder." The impact of Thomas's testimony was immediate and devastating. Here was a living witness with a voice that carried undeniable authority, someone who could describe Maxwell's crimes from personal experience. More importantly, his identity as the son of a respected Apache leader would bring the full weight of federal attention down on Maxwell's operation. Diego fired wildly in Thomas's direction, but the young Apache had been trained in warfare by his father's people during the years before his capture. He moved with fluid grace that turned Diego's desperate shots into wasted ammunition, positioning himself behind cover while maintaining clear lines of sight to both targets. "There's more," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Hidden in the walls of the cellar are the belongings of children who didn't survive Maxwell's training process. Personal items from victims whose families are still searching for them, still wondering what happened to their missing children." Maxwell's weapon swung toward Thomas, but before he could fire, Marshal Crawford's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of federal law enforcement. "Maxwell Holden, Diego Martinez, you are under arrest for kidnapping, human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy against the United States government. Drop your weapons immediately." Maxwell's response was a snarl of pure rage. Instead of surrendering, he lunged toward Hope's position with his knife drawn, the same weapon he had used to kill her father 14 years earlier. But Hope was no longer the terrified 7-year-old who had watched her father die from hiding. Hope rose to meet Maxwell's charge, and in her hand was a weapon she had been saving for this moment, her father's own knife recovered from Eduardo's body and hidden for 14 years while she waited for the chance to use it. The blades met in a clash of steel that rang like a bell throughout the house. Maxwell was larger and stronger, but Hope had been training for this confrontation for half her lifetime. More importantly, she fought with the fury of someone who had endured 14 years of injustice and finally found the chance to balance the scales. The fight was brief, but savage. Maxwell's years of comfortable living had made him soft, while Hope's years of enforced labor had made her lean and strong. When his blade found her shoulder, she used the pain to fuel her counterattack. When he tried to overpower her with brute strength, she used his momentum against him. In the end, it was Eduardo's knife that found Maxwell's heart, driven home by his daughter's hand in perfect poetic justice. Maxwell collapsed with a look of stunned disbelief, his blood pooling on the floor, where it would nourish no more evil. His last words were a whisper that only Hope could hear. "You were supposed to be broken." Hope knelt beside the man who had destroyed her childhood and replied in a voice that carried no hatred, only the calm certainty of justice finally served. "I was never broken, Maxwell. I was just waiting for the right moment to heal." The gunfire from outside was dying down as the Apache warriors completed their victory over Maxwell's reinforcements. Diego, seeing his partner dead and his crimes exposed, made a desperate choice. Instead of surrendering to face justice, he turned his weapon on himself. But Thomas was faster. The young Apache warrior moved with the speed of someone trained in combat, striking Diego's arm and spoiling his aim. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Diego collapsed, his weapon skittering across the floor. "No," Thomas said firmly. "You don't get to escape justice by dying. You're going to live to face trial for what you did to me, to my people, to all the children whose lives you destroyed." Marshal Crawford and Inspector Hayes moved quickly to secure Diego, while Hope stood over Maxwell's body, feeling the strange emptiness that comes when a long-sought goal is finally achieved. For 14 years she had dreamed of this moment, planned for it, lived for it. Now that it was here, she found herself thinking not of vengeance, but of healing, not of the past, but of the future. "Miss Blackwood," Inspector Hayes said gently, approaching her with the careful respect due to someone who had survived unimaginable trauma. "We're going to need your full testimony about everything you've witnessed over the years. The scope of this trafficking network appears to extend far beyond what we initially suspected." Hope nodded, then looked toward Thomas, who was standing near the window, watching Apache warriors emerge from their concealment around the property. His father, Joseph Red Cloud, was among them, an elderly man whose dignity had been forged in the fires of resistance and survival. "Thomas," Hope said softly, "your father has come to take you home." Thomas turned to her with eyes that held tears and gratitude in equal measure. "What about you? Will you come with us? My people would welcome Eduardo Blackwood's daughter with honor." Hope considered the offer, touched by its generosity. But as she looked around the house that had been her prison for so long, she realized that her work here was not finished. Maxwell was dead, and Diego would face federal justice. But there were still secrets buried on this property, still evidence to be uncovered, still victims whose stories needed to be told. "Someday," she promised Thomas. "But first I need to make sure that every child Maxwell stole gets the chance to go home too. There are records hidden throughout this property, information about buyers and trafficking routes that could help reunite families." Thomas nodded with understanding. "Then I will help you. My father's warriors will stay as long as needed to protect this place while we search for evidence. The children of our people deserve justice, and you have shown us how justice can be achieved." Over the following days, Hope and Thomas worked alongside federal investigators to uncover the full scope of Maxwell's criminal empire. The evidence they found was staggering, detailed records of more than 300 children sold over 15 years, correspondence with buyers across the Western Territories, financial documents showing the network's profits in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But they also found something else, evidence that many of the stolen children were still alive, still held in various forms of captivity throughout the region. Hope's testimony and Maxwell's records would be the keys to launching rescue operations that could reunite dozens of families. A week after Maxwell's death, Hope stood once again in Redemption Cemetery, but this time she was not alone. Thomas stood beside her, along with his father Joseph Red Cloud and Marshall Crawford, who had become the lead federal investigator on the trafficking case. They were gathered around a new grave marker, a simple stone that read, "Eduardo Blackwood, beloved father-seeker of justice." Maxwell's stolen wealth had been seized by the federal government, and Hope had used her legal right as Eduardo's heir to purchase proper headstones for her father and Maria. But the most important change was the silver locket Hope now wore around her neck, a gift from her father that she had thought lost forever, found among Maxwell's trophies in his private safe. Inside the locket was a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, smiling with the hope of people who believed in the possibility of a better future. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked. The young man had regained his full strength during their week of working together, and his voice had grown confident with daily use. His father had offered him a place among the tribal council, recognizing the wisdom Thomas had gained through his years of suffering and survival. Hope looked out over the Texas plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon land that legally belonged to her, now that Eduardo's claim had been validated by federal investigators. Beneath that land lay the silver mine that had motivated so much violence and greed, but Hope had already decided what to do with that wealth. "I'm going to build something," she said. "A school for Apache children where they can learn both traditional ways and the skills they'll need to protect themselves in the changing world. A place where families can be reunited, where healing can happen." She paused, then added with a smile that held no trace of the sorrow that had marked her for so many years, "I'm going to build hope." Thomas smiled back, understanding the multiple meanings contained in that simple statement. Hope Blackwood had reclaimed her name, her voice, and her future. More importantly, she had learned that justice was not just about punishing the guilty, it was about healing the wounded and ensuring that the crimes of the past could never be repeated. As they walked back toward the town of Redemption, Hope felt something she had not experienced since childhood, the sensation of moving freely through the world, unafraid and unashamed, with a voice that could speak truth to power and hands that could build rather than merely endure. Behind them, the wind rustled through the cemetery where Maxwell Holden lay in an unmarked grave, already forgotten by history. But ahead of them lay a future bright with possibility, where children could grow up safe from the predators who had once prowled these plains with impunity. Hope Blackwood had found her voice at last, and she intended to use it to sing songs of justice and healing for all the years to come. The silent heart of redemption had learned to beat again, and its rhythm would echo through generations, yet unborn a testament to the power of patience, the strength of truth, and the ultimate triumph of those who refuse to let evil have the final word.